my argument is that the destruction of reason, the method of the destruction of reason, is directly applicable to present day. Remember that the thinkers that Lukács were criticizing, that he was in terms of the critique of irrationalism, say Schopenhauer, Hartmann, Nietzsche, Bergson, and Heidegger, others, Sorel, but all of these thinkers are now considered the building blocks of what we call, left philosophy, the bulk of left philosophy now, which is extraordinary situation, and it makes the destruction of reason increasingly important. And of course, we're seeing fascism and irrationalism in our time in a way that we're looking at possibility of nuclear war, destruction of the environment, and economic breakdown, intensification of imperialism, and meanwhile, we have people on the left attacking human reason.
So before we get started with today's interview with John Bellamy Foster, I want to say a few things regarding The Destruction of Reason by Lukács, the text that is sort of at the background of the conversation you're about to hear and to watch. This is a picture of the great Marxist philosopher Lukács. And in case you didn't know, one of the things that our study groups has recently done is actually hosted the first global conference. If you go to our page, I'm scrolling down here, called Philosophy and the Rise of Fascism. If you click on this, you'll see we have 3 solid days with a number of different philosophers, Marxist thinkers, sociologists, historians, coming together to discuss Lukács' work, The Destruction of Reason, which puts forward a very important theme that basically was abandoned pretty much right when Lukács published the text in the early 1950s. It was never fully followed through, and the text, The Destruction of Reason, never really received its proper hearing, its proper conversation. No substantive conversation was had about Lukács' Destruction of Reason. So one of the things I would say that's really great about what we've been able to do, keeping in mind that many of the academics, many of the thinkers involved with organizing this conference on the destruction of reason that we hosted, which, by the way, was very much thanks to the Patreon support of many of you who've supported us. If you haven't supported us on Patreon, I definitely would encourage you to do so. Just as a reminder, you can do so by going to our Patreon page here, cruising down, selecting $3, $5, or even $10 a month. And what you'll get is access to all of our interviews, including the early access to the interview you're about to hear, for example, with John Bellamy Foster, and other interviews that we do. We're also doing a number of study groups. We're doing a lot of podcasting. We have some great podcasts coming up on the horizon. So stay tuned, and please, if you can, pitch in. We'd love your support. I want to say a few things about this book, The Destruction of Reason. Here is the table of contents of the book. It's a reasonably accessible book. It's not that hard to read. It's much more accessible than, say, Heidegger's Being and Time, for example. So it's a book of historical materialism. It's a book of the history of ideas. It's a book of the history of philosophy, especially of German philosophy, as you can see here in this order of the table of contents. Lukács basically begins with an understanding of how imperialism affects the philosophical milieu of Europe, basically starting from 1848 all the way up to the Second World War. So, as you'll see in our conversation with John Bellamy Foster, the argument is not, as many people have interpreted it, to be that there's a sort of direct line from Schelling to Hitler. That's not what Lukács is saying at all, actually. I'm going to say a couple opening proviso comments regarding what irrationalism is for Lukács, because it's to be understood as a very specific and locatable set of tendencies coming out of neo-Kantianism, actually, and a sort of distortion away from the Hegelian dialectic, right? So it's a sort of abandonment of the Hegelian dialectic by German idealists, but Germany, according to Lukács and according to most, was the sort of center of European thought. And the proposition of Marx was that the proletariat must use philosophy as a weapon, right? Philosophy must actually be inducted in the service of the class struggle, right? So the destruction of reason basically shows the way in which bourgeois philosophy deteriorates from 1848 up to the 1940s, right? So as you can see, you have the birth of irrationalism coming out of the backlash regarding Kant's Copernican revolution, which I'll say a few things about in a moment. You then have a study of Schelling, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, followed by Nietzsche in chapter 3, which you see here, Nietzsche as founder of irrationalism in the imperialist period. So what's very important about that claim, and this is the big claim that got Lukács, I wouldn't say it got him in trouble. It simply was the source of a profound misunderstanding and misreading, because keep in mind, when Theodor Adorno tried to discard and discredit this book, The Destruction of Reason, he did so in a book which was a kind of essay review, not even of The Destruction of Reason. So most people have not given the text a serious study and given it a serious response. This is another reason why I'm so proud that we have been accepted by Historical Materialism, the great Marxist journal, to publish all the essays from the authors that presented in our global conference. So again, your support helped make that possible, which we're all very grateful for. So Lukács puts forward an analysis of Nietzsche, which I highly recommend you read. You'll see here from page 309 to 403. Check it out. It's worth your time. It's going to kind of unlock a perspective on Nietzsche that you've never been exposed to, that is not operating on what Losurdo calls the hermeneutics of innocence. So it's looking at the generation of all of Nietzsche's ideas, all of his concepts, through the prism and through the context, in the context of European imperialism, which is a very interesting argument that John makes about contemporary philosophy today, which is, as you'll see in our conversation, a very significant question, because one of the things that the stage of imperialism does to thought, to intellectual life, to philosophers, is that it pushes out, it encourages a type of naturalization of the exploitation, of the brutality, of the background societal context in which imperialism is justified and in which it's happening, right? This is a sort of telltale sign. In a sense, irrationalism promotes what Lukács calls indirect apologetics of capitalism. So it's a type of critique of capitalism from within the right? Which is very novel and very unique about what Lukács locates, because he locates it within, again, this specific genealogy. And again, that doesn't have to do with fascism. In fact, you'll see here, chapter 4 is on vitalism. So you have a whole series of analyses of Simmel, Spengler, Bergson, Heidegger, Carl Schmitt, as well as even more moderate bourgeois philosophers. Max Weber appears, Max Scheler appears here. So this is a deep study of the main currents of intellectual life. He also brings a whole analysis of neo-Hegelianism to bear, But one of this last chapter you'll see on social Darwinism, racial theory, and fascism is one of the more important ones and one of the more overlooked contributions of the destruction of reason, which is why I was happy that several of our scholars are going to be writing essays about Lukács's contributions to understanding social Darwinism and its connection to this lineage of irrationalist thought, right? So this is a bit of an overview of the text to give you a sense before you read it, if you haven't read it. The epilogue was written at the dawn of the Korean War, and that's very significant because it basically was rejected by the Western Marxists, in part because they perceived it as too critical of imperialism. Many Western Marxists and many socialists were for the Korean War. And even Frederick Jameson, once in one of his commentaries on the destruction of reason, he mentions this as well. So there's something very, very symptomatic about what Lukács is saying about the relationship between imperialism and the deterioration of intellectual life in the context of imperialism. Of course, the other big reason that the text has been ignored and pushed away is because it portrays the schism between Marx and Nietzsche to be one of a non-rapport, right? There's a kind of non-rapport, a non-relation in a Lacanian sense between these two thinkers, you see? And subsequent leftists simply adopted Nietzscheanism so deeply into the edifice of their thought, not all of them, but many of them, especially in France. The French Nietzschean current was very strong, and there's many reasons. We've talked about this before. You can see my interview with Jan Raymond to understand that. You can see my interview with Jeff Waite, the author of Nietzsche's Corpse, which are all on the YouTube page as well. So that's one of the background reasons. It's a completely new reading of Nietzsche. And of course, I think many of you know I'm working on a new book, which is touching on this. My book is about much more than just the Lukács legacy, but it is touching on this. This is a poster of our conference and the scholars who presented. We were honored to work with Verso and with Deakin University as partners for this conference. And I recommend you guys check it out on the page. This is a photograph of a very interesting philosopher who comes up in my conversation with John Bellamy Foster, who was the academic assistant and protege of Lukács, also a Hungarian Marxist philosopher, Esteban Mészáros. And Mészáros was a prolific author. He wrote on alienation. He wrote on Lukács's philosophy itself. Basically, Lukács saw him as sort of taking over his project, right? In many different ways. He was hugely influential in Venezuela. We come to learn that John Bellamy Foster himself is responsible for publishing a major book by Mészáros on the state, which we talk about in the conversation you're about to hear. This work that he wrote on Jean-Paul Sartre is very interesting as well. Even though Mészáros is a Marxist, he finds a great deal of sort of positive insight from Sartre, and this is extremely interesting and worth looking at. So with that, I'd like to now introduce today's interview with John Bellamy Foster. I hope you enjoy. Welcome back, everyone. Daniel here with Professor John Bellamy Foster at the University of Oregon, where he teaches sociology and is also an editor at the Monthly Review. Professor Foster is a leading voice in Marxist thought and study, has written extensively on topics of imperialism, ecology, political economy, and has really innovated, especially in the field of ecology, a lot of new directions in Marxist thinking. John has written a nice new essay for Monthly Review called The New Irrationalism. And we're going to be talking about this very, very interesting contribution that you've made. But I want to start, if we might, by asking you a little bit about when you were younger. When did you first encounter Lukács's work? What really drew you to Lukács?
Well, I first encountered the work of István Mészáros, who was Lukács's assistant in Hungary, and who worked closely with Lukács and actually inherited his mantle at the Institute of Aesthetics. But then the Hungarian Revolution came along and the Soviet invasion, and Mészáros had to leave. But I read Mészáros's work early, his Marxist theory of alienation in the 1970s, and that took me to Lukács's work fairly early on too. And I had an unusual way of, I guess, approaching Lukács, because I read History and Class Consciousness right away. I read it through the viewpoint of his 1967 preface to History and Class Consciousness, where he had his self-critique. And also I read the Conversations of Lukács in 1967 at the same time. So I entered into Lukács from a different standpoint than most of the Western left, which simply starts with History and Class Consciousness and tends to not encounter the later Lukács or dismisses his work.
And we're going to talk about sort of some of the dismissals of Lukács's thinking, but as I see it, it's an interesting moment right now for turning back and looking at the missed encounter of Lukács on the left. And there's no text which exemplifies a missed encounter more than Destruction of Reason.
Mm-hmm.
Could we talk perhaps, to start off with, a bit of a snapshot in your view of what the achievement of this text, The Destruction of Reason, is, and what compelled you to write The New Irrationalism, which, by the way, John's essay is about the destruction of reason and about its importance, because the notion of irrationalism is developed by Lukács in this book. So could we pivot to The Destruction of Reason and just give us a little high-level sense of why this is such an important text?
Well, first, for me, it was a very important text for a long time, and I became close friends with Mészáros, and we would talk about The Destruction of Reason, because I was always dealing with issues of left ideology, the changes in philosophy, and attacks on Marxism. And The Destruction of Reason was then a very fundamental text in my own thinking. But this article, The New Irrationalism, although in a way it's about the destruction of reason, I wrote it because I was concerned with what was happening to philosophy and to critical thought in the present. And I suddenly realized the full depth to which irrationalism was penetrating left thought. And I went back to The Destruction of Reason to look at how Lukács had approached the whole period that he covered, from essentially the 1848 aftermath of the 1848 revolutions up to the post-Second World War period. And then I tried to look at how that is reflected in our own time, using a historical materialist approach. So my real object in writing it was to show how the destruction of reason helps unlock the present. But this destruction of a reason is absolutely fundamental text, and it's sometimes been criticized heavily. It was rejected by Western Marxist thinkers, even though Lukács was is considered to be, in some ways, the founder of Western Marxism. The Destruction of Reason was rejected probably more than any other work that he wrote. So much so that the Western left thinkers like Adorno or George Lichtheim, and you go down the list, they simply dismissed the Destruction of Reason, which was the enormously powerful text, and Maisros considered it to be, along with History and Class Consciousness and the young Hegel, one of Lukács's three greatest works that would stand the test of time. And yet it was utterly dismissed by the left. It wasn't subjected to a critique or even what you could call criticisms. It was simply referred to as an intellectual disaster or intellectual crime, criticized for being a Stalinist text, and so on, all in terms of vituperative language and dismissals. No encounter with it at all, which also is a puzzle, raises questions for us. And my conclusion was that although the main complaint was that Lukács saw philosophers, the irrationalist philosophers, as leading directly to Hitler and fascism, and so the book was dismissed as a crude, analysis in that respect. Lukács didn't ever make that argument, or that wasn't really the nature of his argument. So the book was dismissed on false grounds. And what really upset the Western left was the fact that Lukács, in his epilogue, saw the irrationalism that he was depicting as carrying over into the post-Second World War period and to the U.S. imperium and having an effect on the left. So all of this was context in which I looked at the book. Now, in looking at the Destruction of Reason itself, the central argument was that after the 1848 revolution in Europe and particularly in Germany, but after the defeat of the 1848 revolutions, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, abandoned Hegel and Feuerbach's philosophy and picked up on irrationalist philosophers, Arthur Schopenhauer at first, and also Kierkegaard, Nietzsche came along. But originally, after the 1848 revolution, Schopenhauer was the major figure, and then there is another phase in Lukács's analysis on irrationalism, and this is the main part of the argument. He says irrationalism was really associated with imperialism in Lenin's sense of imperialism representing the monopoly stage of capitalism, a growing conflict between the capitalist states. Germany had emerged as a nation state, and Italy, and there was more tension and threat of war, and monopoly capitalism concentrated power, and the whole system became more irrational at an elemental level. And in philosophy, you have the carrying forward of this irrationalism, say, of Schopenhauer, where the age of reason is under attack, and in the imperialist period, this becomes even more profound, that reason becomes the enemy. And Lukács argued that philosophy, to a large extent, adopted an indirect apologetics, no longer opposing capitalism directly, but actually attacking capitalism, attacking bourgeois society, but from the right, in a rejection from the right that could admit all of the evils of the system and all the contradictions, all of the terror and exploitation, but approach it from the right in terms of irrationalism. This is using that this was based on the will to life, the will to power, instinct, intuition, that the myth. They incorporated vitalism, any kind of non-rational, non-reason type of argument in order to attack bourgeois society, but particularly to attack socialism. Nietzsche was really gloried in the destruction of the Paris Commune, and in Marxism, imperialism is often seen as arising in the period right after the Paris Commune. So none of this was accidental. It had to do with historical changes at the time. I could talk about some of the individual thinkers like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and so on, but this is the background, and Lukács saw it in terms of irrationalism, and fascism comes on later. And of course, fascism is part of irrationalism, but the irrationalism is much broader than fascism itself, and he associated it with imperialism and monopoly capitalism as a whole. So it's not simply a question of seeing these thinkers as precursors of fascism. Right. They represented what in philosophy is understood as a rationalist tradition that is very important, and did in some ways, of course, since it's reactionary, pave the way to even more reactionary development.
Yeah, that's great. Lukács is criticized because he centers Hegel as the completion of philosophy in a way. And so part of the argument, I mean, you may not agree with that exactly, but this is how a lot of folks interpret Lukács' argument, which is that, well, Hegel gave a comprehensive solution to bourgeois philosophy. And one of the consequences of that, as it pertains to an understanding of society, is that Hegel kind of provides a rational framework philosophically to account for social antagonisms, to account for in a rational way, so that the logic of the system of society, the logic of capital, the social relations are that the philosopher has a sort of stake in that conversation, and that Hegel kind of completes something. And so therefore, the historical materialist argument after 1848, and it's no surprise that Schopenhauer, by the way, insisted on being housed outside of the university. That's actually quite important. Lukács says this, and so did Nietzsche, right? So there's a total abandonment of the responsibility of the intellectual within European university systems, which constitutes a big change from the Kantian and the Hegelian line. So something went awry after 1848, and Lukács is locating it there. And one of the other things we should say is that it presupposes that the intellectual has a unique vantage point on the truth through the vital suprasensible myth that only the philosopher, and this is huge for Nietzsche, obviously, that the philosopher can create a kind of sub-community, and even, why not, a kind of alternative to the Marxian proletariat, in some sense, that these elect, and the new theory of the elect, can access truth in some rarefied way. So irrationalism is not, I think, to be understood in a narrow sense. It's a very specific set of features that develop here. And I think that's important because often when we talk about the history of irrationalism, we're talking about a very specific lineage. So if a thinker, say today, is working in that lineage, it's ethically very important to point out the history of that lineage and its connection from a historical materialist standpoint. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. If you could flesh out a little bit more about that, perhaps, about kind of help us understand what Lukács means by irrationalism a bit more, because people get kind of lost in the weeds with this.
Well, actually, irrationalism goes back to our concept of reason, right? And like you said, for Lukács, Hegel, in a different way, Marx, represent the development of critical dialectical reason. So for him, that's the ultimate development of reason. But he might even have included Lenin in that, because Lenin really was a profound thinker as well. But reason in Lukács's view isn't all that narrow, in the sense that when we think of reason, we think of everything from Cartesian rationalism, from the rationalism that arose out of the Enlightenment, and which of course has its limitations, but it was an enormously important development, and it's from that we get the concept of the Age of Reason. And then you have the German development of reason, starting, really principally Kant and Hegel. And for Lukács, all of this is important. And on the one hand, he would criticize aspects of bourgeois thought or mainstream capitalist thought, like classical political economy. Lukács dealt with that in the young Hegel, but he wouldn't see classical political economy, or a large part of what was done in Western thought, classical political economy, the science, natural science, and so on. Lukács would not see that as all irrationalist. The irrationalism is not simply synonymous with bourgeois thought. It's a particular lineage, as you said, that developed in a particular time. And I like to think about it in Thomas Mann, who was really a very mainstream thinker, but committed. The novelist Thomas Mann, great thinker. He was very much a bourgeois liberal thinker, but for Lukács, he represented the highest ideals of bourgeois reason. And in 1930, Mann had gave his speech, An Appeal to Reason, where he was basically arguing against the growth of irrationalism in Germany, and also arguing against the growth of fascism in Germany at the time and in Europe. And he was arguing that although he was coming from a very bourgeois standpoint, and very much a product of the Enlightenment and what Lukács would think was the highest manifestation of reason in Germany, Mann was arguing that the middle class, the German middle class, had to work with the socialists, because he said that they too believed in the intellect, and they needed to fight against these irrationalist tendencies in a kind of common cause, that the commitment to reason tied them together. And so when Lukács wrote The Destruction of Reason, he wasn't, as some people say, just sort of going after capitalist society in some sort of crude way. He was actually writing at a time. I mean, the book was actually written during the Korean War, but after the Second World War, but under a new imperialism. And he was writing it with that kind of view that somehow the forces of reason, in which he would include much of bourgeois culture and science, had to, and of course socialism, had to come together to fight these irrationalist tendencies that were so general, so dangerous, and so generalized. And if you look at the German lineage that he's talking about, I mean, Schopenhauer, of course, so Schopenhauer was rich. He inherited a lot of wealth, so he didn't have to teach in a university, and he just did his philosophy on his own. And he tried to set up his lectures opposite those of Hegel's, and in order to defeat Hegel, and then nobody came to his lectures. And it was only later, after the 1848 revolution, when that that Schopenhauer became popular. Let me just say something about my own personal biography on this. When I was young, I was involved very heavily in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and we were out struggling all the time, and particularly it was involved in the later period after the invasion of Cambodia, but what happened is, I had a radical background, but I didn't quite. My parents were socialists, but I didn't really understand the full enormity of the system at that time. And we were out there protesting, and then the tear gas comes out, and people get shot, and the repression was enormous, and the movement fell apart. And I got really depressed, cynical, and pessimistic. And so what did I do? I sat down and I started reading Kierkegaard. Well, I read Schopenhauer first. I studied Wordle as will and representation. I liked his solipsism. I liked his notion that the world was our representation. I didn't want to accept the world as it was. So at that point, I felt very cynical, and I thought, okay, I'm going to have my own world as my own representation. And I really got involved in Schopenhauer until I read what he said about women, and I threw all of his books out. Well, not literally, but and I got into reading Kierkegaard, concept of dread, fear and trembling, and so on, sickness unto death, and I was reading Nietzsche, but I also entered college, and I was studying Marx as well, and as it turned out, Marcuse and Maisros. But what really got me out of the funk is that the United States basically directed the coup in Chile, and I decided that time I wasn't going to have anything to do with this kind of irrationalist philosophy, that this was a system that had to be fought. And even if we were in a period of defeat, I was going to, and even if defeat would continue, I was going to struggle against the system. So that became the decision that governed my subsequent life. But it was, I went through that phase. And after the 1848 revolution, with all the defeats, the left at that time, the bourgeois left, went to Schopenhauer, and then to Hartmann, Edward von Hartmann, who believed in cosmic suicide, and his very influential philosophy, and then Nietzsche, and so on. And after 1968, of course, the postmodernism got a big boost because people had a sense of defeat. So these things come out of historical conditions, and it isn't just a question of ideas developing on their own. And so when I read read and reread The Destruction of Reason, for me, the marvelous thing about uh, Lukács's text is that it's historically based. He has this sense of this lineage didn't arise out of nowhere. It arose out of historical conditions. It reflected the alienation in capitalist society, and the destruction of reason was a manifestation of that alienation, and it was something that we could resist and change. And he was trying to defend reason. The book isn't about defending Marxism, although his approach is a historical materialist one.
Mhm.
He's he's drawing a line, trying to create an alliance of sorts
Mhm.
with reason as the basis against irrationalism.
Yeah, and I mean it's a very interesting proposal that Engels I feel appears in The Destruction of Reason in very interesting ways, insofar as Engels, in his later reflections on Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy, does make the claim that that the proletariat becomes the heir of Hegelianism, which means that um, it's kind of a class argument that the working class across Europe becomes the true heir of reason in a certain way, and that the demands politically that were opened in the French Revolution, the universal promises of the French Revolution, are almost only realizable by the proletariat. So that's a fascinating argument, because if you say, well, you know, that no longer holds today, well, you're almost shutting down the a certain view on Marx's proletariat in some sense. So if you're rejecting that line, or if you're saying that somehow that all came to an end, I don't know, at the Second World War or something like that, that seems to be what some people say about the book, where they say, well, Lukács is talking about a moment in time. Or as Enzo Traverso tried to say in his recent introduction to the book, he says, this is a book that's written from the perspective of a socialist victor, which is such a weird, or such a strange way to say it. But I get the sense, John, that you don't agree with that framing of the destruction of reason, that you feel that that's not accurate, that in fact, this book still has a lot to teach us today. It's not a sort of talking about a dead and bygone era, right? Because in your essay, you say, well, we're in a new era of imperialism. So from a historical materialist standpoint, an era of imperialism is going to have effects in the world of intellectual ideas. And it is. And we'll talk about that. But so can you, I guess I'm wanting you to talk a bit more directly to the critics of this book who might say some of these things I just mentioned.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. But first, what you were saying about the shutting down of Marx's proletariat, the Engels had said the proletariat is really carries reason forward, and in the sense of the dialectic, and of course, Lukács's History and Class Consciousness was very much in that tradition. And I was thinking in terms of the irrationalism that we're seeing today, which we can see as coming out of postmodernism. Postmodernism is something that I was critical of, but felt it also made some important contributions, and yet I realized that the irrationalism has sort of sunk deeper and deeper and become more embedded in the left, and that this has become a serious problem, and it's a result of our own historical conditions. But when my first response to postmodernism and post-structuralism was that and I think this is true of the left. First of all, class is decentered, and the human subject is decentered. So history and praxis are decentered, and the whole notion of grand historical narratives is thrown out. And all of this was very important. We'd say, well, there's no emancipatory project in postmodernism, post-structuralism. It's a defeatist view. There's no praxis. There's really no history left because it's dehistoricized everything. Ellen Makesons Wood and I edited a book called In Defense of History, where we looked at postmodernism and how it had basically abandoned a historical viewpoint and a viewpoint of praxis. Terry Eagleton wrote a piece for that, which preceded his allusions of postmodernism, where he explained it was all really a product of a defeat. So these were the things that we were concerned with, and constantly the left would say, yeah, well, postmodernism has things to offer, but it's abandoned the fight, right? And it's abandoned the class, it's abandoned praxis, and abandoned emancipatory project. But recently, because of posthumanism, which is a further development, I think, that actually brings out some of the more irrationalist tendencies of this whole lineage. In this, we're talking about the post-Second World War period, but the posthumanism is more a product of the last decade or two. And since I work in the ecological realm, we're struggling we're struggling against the climate change trajectory, how capitalism is pushing us over the edge and destroying the planet as a safe place for humanity, and it's happening very fast. And it's understood that this is real. You have to approach it from the standpoint of realism and materialism. You have to know the natural science. You have to build the movements in relation to all of that. And ecological Marxism or eco-socialism has developed, and it's drawn on Marx's fundamental ecological critique, and things were actually moving forward. But then the post-humanists have entered into the discussion and taken a very kind of reactionary, disorganizing, destabilizing positions. And I realized at that point that Lukács was right in a different way than I had fully contemplated or recognized. I realized, and I went back to Paul Baran's statement in a letter that I in the Age of Revolution that I edited. And Paul Baran said that the crux of Marxism is being able to bring reason, he meant critical dialectical reason, together with class-based social forces. And basically the notion is that you can destroy the movement, you can destroy the class movement, you can destroy Marxism or hope for humanity, really, by either going after class or going after reason. If reason is destroyed, if rationalism prevails, there's no way to construct an effective movement. And I saw this happening with respect to ecology in the last few years, especially. And that caused me to go back to the whole, to Lukács's argument and the whole lineage to understand how that's happened. How is it that the thinkers who are supposed to be on the left today, the leading philosophers revered by the left, that they draw on as their fundamental basis, rather than drawing on Marx, really, are the irrationalists. Why
Yeah.
is it that the left is drawing principally on Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Bergson,
Hmm.
so on, who were the enemies of the left? Some
Hmm.
of them, Carl Schmitt, some of them actual Nazis, and how could this be? And and how is this irrationalism carried forward? That was my question.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I want to go back to the thing you said regarding ecology and the danger of posthumanism, because I think that that's not immediately apparent to most people why that would be a danger. But before we touch on that, you referenced several times the theme of irrationalism as contributing to a freezure or an impossibility of the rational thinking of class politics. And that's a very interesting way of thinking about postmodernism, because, Ellen Maskin Wood, who you mentioned, wrote a very famous work in, I think, the late 90s about the abandonment of class. And she accused so-called post-Marxists of who were pulling from and kind of moving away from Marxist materialism, accusing them of doing this. And I think in the wake of 2016 and 2020, the rise of, speaking of, and in the American context, the rise of Bernie Sanders and the reintroduction of class politics, perhaps that's one reason why Lukács's argument, your argument, and Ellen Maskin Wood's argument starts to make more sense to us, right? We start to see this connection. So that's a very interesting argument, because Nietzsche, Lukács says, was a philosopher who carefully tried to extinguish the coherence of class itself. That was actually part of one of Nietzsche's core objectives, according to Lukács. And of course, in Domenico Losurdo's Aristocratic Rebel, you see that much more clearly. So in other words, Lukács says, to paraphrase, we can understand the entirety of Nietzsche's philosophy as a commentary on the class struggle between bourgeoisie and proletariat of his time, and an attempt to move beyond it and to create a different conception of philosophy that would set the proletarian struggle in its place. So in that sense, Nietzsche inserts himself in the class struggle, but as a great antagonist to Marxism. And Lukács says this is abundantly clear if you're a close reader of Nietzsche. And of course, very few Nietzschean scholars have commented on Lukács's argument, because he's a specialist in German philosophy. He really knows what he's talking about, right? There's no question.
Yeah.
So, but now we have folks like Deleuze and Guattari, who I think are very creative and interesting philosophers coming out of the May 68 moment. But Deleuze says in the early 60s, Nietzsche is more important than Freud and Marx. And then he and Guattari, they do create a philosophy which puts Nietzsche at the very center and Marx at the margin. So that's not to say I'm not going to say that they're anti-Marxist, because they say that they are Marxists, and that's fine. But it's also true that they're incorporating and putting Nietzsche at the center. And I think there's a lot of danger with that. And I know you agree, but perhaps you might say something about that.
Yeah, in terms of Lukács's critique of Nietzsche, I was especially impressed by and I explored this myself in my article, going a little bit beyond what Lukács had said, because it's my area. I came out of political economy, but Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil basically says life is exploitation, or life is, says what he does is he conflates appropriation, that is taking from nature and getting property, with exploitation and expropriation. He clearly conflates all of them, and basically says then that life is exploitation, life is expropriation, and there's no more direct attack on Marx than that. I mean, it's extraordinary if you think of the implications of it, and then it's connected to his whole notion of the will to power, the eternal recurrence, etc. And Lukács understood this, that this was the destruction of reason in Nietzsche. He also explores Nietzsche's concept of becoming and being, and explains it in such a way, brings out the irrationalism. He explains it in such a way that it's almost a complete precursor to Heidegger. You can see Heidegger in the very thing that he's attacking. That's this going to a philosophy of immanence, moving away from actual human beings towards Dasein, an extreme ontological being, and this feeds into a rationalism where the human subject sort of disappears, is no longer seen as important. So all of these things are part of the destruction of reason. But then when I read Deleuze's Nietzschean philosophy, it's amazing to me because he actually accentuates the irrationalism that Lukács found in Nietzsche. He goes, and what Deleuze does in particular is he goes after the dialectic. He goes after reason, dialectical reason, directly. And Nietzsche, of course, and he brings out how Nietzsche, the core of Nietzsche was not just going after socialism and class, it was destroying the notion of dialectic. And this is what Deleuze argues, and this is what he finds important and useful in Nietzsche. So then Nietzsche just becomes this nomadic rejection, and this becomes the basis of Deleuze's philosophy. It has nothing to do with anything on the left. I mean, they may claim, I don't know if Deleuze claimed to be a Marxist. Instead, at some points, people have quoted, he said, well, he admired Marx, but all of that is frivolity. I mean, the whole analysis is aimed at destroying the entire Hegelian Marxian tradition and building on the most reactionary parts of the Nietzschean tradition, and bringing in Bergson's vitalism, reinterpreting Spinoza as a vitalist thinker, which is quite amazing. And it's all a quite profound irrationalism. It looks to students, because one of the problems I have is that this is very popular in universities among students who think who are on the left, right? They conceive of themselves on the left, but they don't understand this lineage or the implications. So they think anything that criticizes capitalism is necessarily left. But irrationalism and fascism have always criticized capitalism. I don't want to equate irrationalism and fascism. They're both, although linked to imperialism, but if you attack, you can attack capitalism and also attack reason, and attack class. Mm-hmm. There's nothing left. There's no possibility of a left anymore. So that Deleuze and Guattari actually start off their Capitalism and Schizophrenia by saying, I mean, they set it up all in the beginning. Yeah, they're going to criticize capitalism, but what they do is they say that they pretend that they're drawing on Marx, but they say the whole world is one. They completely dismiss the alienation, what Marx called the tragic flaw. So they dismiss all contradictions and all questions of dialectic and change. And then they say that it's all really based on that capitalism itself is a product of the desiring machines that constitute human beings, and it's back. It's a Nietzsche trumping Marx,
Mhm.
and there's
Mhm.
no possibility of any reason, because reason has been destroyed, and irrationalism is the elemental condition of society. But this kind of philosophy is going to become um, popular in a very irrationalist and defeated age. I think, though, that we're in a period where the challenges facing humanity are so great that younger generations are not, the younger generation is not going to be so attracted to this, because
Mhm.
people are ready to fight.
Yeah.
If they weren't ready to fight, they don't want Nietzsche in their camp. Basically,
Right.
they don't. Nietzsche's useless. Um, Deleuze is useless. Schopenhauer is useless. The Heidegger is worse than useless.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so there has to be a return to Marx and Hegel, which is enormously more uh, challenging, more it Hegel makes these other philosophies look like uh, miniature dolls, right?
Right. Right.
There's nothing in these in this analysis with its combination of intuition and rationalism and instincts and myths and magic and
Mhm.
the supernatural and the paranormal and so on, that compares to historical dialectical reason and its connection to human praxis.
Mhm. No, I think that's all very well and good. And I remember sharing your article online, and a younger person, I'm assuming they're younger, said something interesting, which is, well, the author is attacking all of the philosophers that I fell in love with, that I really have a close fondness, admiration for. And part of the 68ers, the 68 philosophy, when they turn to Nietzsche, Nietzsche has the Dionysian thing. He has a very ludic, very expressive philosophy that emphasizes a certain politicization of culture. And so, therefore, a lot of what you get in Deleuze and Guattari is counterculture politics. And, I mean, there's an interesting history there. I'm thinking here of, like, I mean, I think in any socialist revolutionary sequence, there's going to be a counterculture. There's nothing wrong with counterculture. I mean, the Bolsheviks had incredible countercultures. And actually, I just wrote a book on Nietzsche where I show how they debated Nietzsche so vehemently. So what I'm trying to say is that um, let's resurrect Lukács's way of looking at Nietzsche today and debate Nietzsche, because that's what he wanted. He wanted people to see him as an enemy, as a kind of antagonist. You have to lose me before you really find me. You have to fight me. That's what he's always saying with Zarathustra. So instead of a kind of, because that's the other thing, is people have written about this, is Deleuze's Nietzschean philosophy removes all of his political intentions. He strips Nietzsche from his time. So it's very ironic. Yeah, he's trying to remove away from dialectics, move away from class, but his understanding of Nietzsche has no recognition that, like we said before, Nietzsche is a great thinker of class, not in a good way, but that's okay. You see my point?
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting line of thing, and that actually draws me to my next question, which is, um, because the right wing, like Jordan Peterson and these other, we could list the names of people that do this, say that postmodernism is somehow connected with Marxism and that it's a left. Well, what they end up doing is that what I've seen after reading your article and seeing the response, my interpretation is that a lot of people now turn to the ideas behind postmodernism and they say, well, actually, those are the sources of defending the rights of trans community, of queer community, of minority community, of et cetera, et cetera. And even Deleuze and Guattari were saying, yeah, well, Marx's proletariat is done, but now we need to think of a new kind of minority-driven form of thinking politics. And so what I fear gets missed there is a sense in which, well, Marxism is seen as somehow traditional or sort of a past bygone age. And what are these guys trying to resurrect this for? I want to get your thoughts on that and how maybe we can address this concern, because it does make sense that people feel that way, that they feel assaulted if postmodernism is assaulted. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it's really a complicated issue. I mean, it is true that a lot of what the left does is filtered through postmodernism, and a lot of it is really good, right? I think one of the questions, and I enjoy reading Nietzsche, even though I find aspects of his thought abhorrent. I enjoy reading a lot of things that I don't think are the path that we want to take, but that they do. Nietzsche does provide a lot of reflections on the human condition, on human beings, and sometimes it really hits the mark. But the problem is making Nietzsche the fundamental basis of one's thought and one's action, or even worse, Heidegger, who's sometimes characterized as the leading philosopher of the 20th century, but carries all of this terrible baggage. But making these thinkers the fundamental basis of one's thought, rather than taking some aspects, becomes problematic. Now, and so, for example, the postmodernist tradition has, and even, thinker like Deleuze has emphasized the concept of difference, right? Well, that's important. It's not that you couldn't get that from the Marxist tradition itself. I mean, in terms of the dialectic, Lukács talked about the identity of identity and non-identity, right? That contradiction, and but the concept of difference has, in certain respects, been very important in terms of defending different ways of being and living, and so to the extent that like postmodernism has promoted that, it's good. The right, of course, wants to in the United States, the right sees Marxism as the source of all evil, and it wants to associate all the left postmodernism with Marxism and or and call it cultural Marxism or whatever, and they're not really concerned with what's correct or incorrect. They want to, it's simply a position. The fact is that the right is very irrationalist itself, and it has no problems with the irrationalist aspects of this lineage that we're talking about. It has the problems are where that lineage overlaps with Marxism itself, because Marxists have always been the leader in dealing with issues of race and gender. I mean, in terms of traditions of thought, there are problems and imperfections and any irrationalities in any tradition, but Marxists have always been on the ground leaders in these areas in terms of race and gender and trans, and that's not really that may be like called cultural, that might be confused with postmodernism and so on, but it's where the postmodernism overlaps with Marxism that it becomes dangerous to the system. It's not the areas where it attacks Marxism. It isn't the Nietzsche part, or the Heidegger are not dangerous to the system. But so yeah, and it is very confusing because a lot of students now, they haven't. I counter students at the university, they haven't ever read Hegel, and they haven't ever really read Marx, and they haven't read Lukács, and they haven't read. They might have read Adorno, right? But their view of Marxism is a product of reading this irrationalist lineage. So maybe
Right.
their first introduction to Marx is reading Derrida's Spectres of Marx or something like that. They
Yeah.
really, and so they have this incredibly distorted view, and they actually think that the dialectic is the same thing as dualism. That
Hmm.
because dialectic, comes from the word two, they think that it just means dualism, and they have the most, and all of this irrationalism that's penetrated the left, and it's very anti-humanist and has deconstructed the human subject, is very dangerous in that yet it creates some kind of malaise. It creates a distorted version of Marxism too. Marxism is supposed to be some sort of rigid view, and the
Yeah.
proletariat is some sort of fixed entity,
Hmm.
and somehow these other views are more liberatory. The irrationalist tradition also plays a lot into some of the anarchist
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
traditions, which are very individualist at their base. So,
So the idea is, in simple sense, is that we need rationalism for today's class struggles, so that broad working class interests can coalesce. Even we can even use the term of a kind of consciousness or even an education in such a way that we create a kind of strong countervailing class force that will pose a true opposition to bourgeois power today, and to so that therefore it's only on the foundation of an engaged rational dialectical force that we can actually muster up any possibility of having a kind of counterpower, or a kind of a true contestation against these forces that are keeping the status quo in place. Is that one way that you might connect reason, or a defense of reason, to the class struggle? How might you parse that out? Because you end your article by saying, well, in South America, things look maybe more promising in terms of this coalescence of class-based politics. But could you say a little bit more about what you mean by that, and how that might be connected I guess, to the tradition of reason?
yeah, I think of Lukács is trying to defend reason in order to hold off these irrationalist tendencies and imperialism, to really combat um, imperialism, fascism, and a reaction in general, and the belief that there is a future. You have it's interesting, Sartre, who really was on the other side in the French debates from this, talked about impossible revolutions, and that seems, we don't really like to think of them as impossible, but we're told there is no exit, that change is impossible. And he argued we can't accept that. We have to fight for the impossible revolutions. That actually reason tells us that. Now we're in a situation, and I do so much work in the ecology, we're in a situation where we're facing the destruction of the planet as a safe place for humanity, and the decisive period is in the next couple of decades. But we could actually, the science says that we are on track to destroy the whole basis of industrial civilization in this century. if we don't turn around. I mean, that would happen if we reach 4 degrees, but if we reach a 2 degree increase, 2 degree increase in global average temperature, which is not very far away, then they believe that we will be in a doom loop, or the positive feedbacks will come into effect to the extent that we can't turn things around or control them anymore, and we'll just head that way. So we really have to struggle for human survival, and that really depends on the organization of the population from the ground level, which means class, and it means reason, and it means impossible revolutions, because we need a revolutionary scale action, such as the earth is, since the world has never seen before. And yet we have these irrationalist philosophies that are prevalent, that are actually, they're anti-humanist, and not just rejecting the worst aspects of Enlightenment humanism, but rejecting humanism altogether, even to the point of any conception of humanity. They're anti-naturalist. They tend to be anti-science, and
these are the new materialists. Is that
the new materialists are coming out of this lineage, and this is extraordinary problem, and it's all part of what we're facing now. That, like Kenny Chokrov said, that the whole nature of the philosophies that are dominant now on the left, ironically, argue for the radicalization of the impossibility of exit, or they represent the radicalization of the impossibility of exit. And that is the problem. They remove all that we know about history and historical change and dialectical processes and reason and praxis, and substitute these, the notion of a nomadic multitude. Hardt and Negri's empire became kind of a bestseller after the New York Times and Times Magazine and Foreign Affairs and CBS News and so on praised it to the skies. But what it said was that imperialism no longer existed. No wonder they liked the book so much. But the really interesting part to me is that they used Heidegger, Schmidt, and Nietzsche, and particularly Nietzsche, to argue that the dialectic no longer existed, and that all we had was Nietzschean rejection and repulsion and nomadic and deterritorialization, and that leaves us with nothing. That's a capitulation to the reality, and it was celebrated as the first Marxist work in eons to really be a favorite of the mainstream press.
Whew. Wow. So I want to go back for a second to your area of ecology and ask you about the transhumanists as well as the new materialists, because I feel that a lot of folks, when they read like Bruno Latour, for example, or Timothy Morton, they may not see some of the dangers that you're pointing out as it pertains to the philosophical orientation that these thinkers bring to thinking ecology. And I think that a lot of people listening to our conversation will be interested in, and I know that a lot of young people are signing up for ecology classes, and it's such an incredibly important subject. But philosophically, you raise some very serious issues in these thinkers. Can you just give us a feel for some of the things that people should maybe look out for when they're reading some of these thinkers on ecology?
Well, first of all, you mentioned the distinction between, the post-humanists and transhumanists. There's actually two traditions in post-humanism. One is more the new materialists, which I'm concerned with, who come out of this irrationalist lineage. The other ones, the transhumanists, are more concerned with the technological aspect. Donna Haraway is closer to that, but more the notion that our conception of the human being is breaking down because of changes in biological reproduction, and how we handle that, and the whole question of trans and I see that part of it as rational and important. I mean, the question of how technology is affecting our biology and the complexities arising from that. And that's very important in terms of the struggles of trans peoples. But the new materialism is that comes under post-humanism, and that I'm concerned with, basically has gone in a very extreme direction, so that the for the real core of it, in some ways, they come out of Nietzsche and Deleuze and so on, and they accept Deleuze's reinterpretation of Spinoza, and they like Bergson, and they're very vitalistic. The new materialism is really a vitalistic materialism, which is a kind of a negation of what materialism has always meant in science, in the broad sense, not just natural science. So they think of life, like Bergson, as sort of well, they want to impose life on all of matter, and they want these vitalistic elements introduced. So one of the core things is that they attack Marx's theory of commodity fetishism. So Latour in his Factish book, and Timothy Morton and Jane Bennett and others, they all attack Marx's critique of commodity fetishism, and they attack the notion of fetishism. They attack the notion of critique, and altogether. And what this means is that, basically, if you look at Marx's critique of commodity fetishism, that was very much at the center of Lukács's theory of reification. To put it in the simplest terms, the commodity fetishism is when social relations are transformed into relations of things, so that we see the relations of things, commodities, which take on active properties, almost in a mystical way, like religion, and we don't see the social relations, the productive relations that underlie those. So commodities take on, and things, if you want to look at the broader sense of reification, take on a reality and all their own, and we lose sight of the human social properties. Now, so that's sort of the basis of the critique of commodity fetishism and reification, and yet this is being rejected. This is one of the issues. I mean, it's a straight out attack on Marx. Like Latour, Bennett, and Morton have all argued that the critique of commodity fetishism is unfair to the commodities, the things. And this comes out of what we call object-oriented ontology as well. So, which is tied with a new materialism, and Morton goes. I mean, Latour says it's completely arbitrary to take human beings as the basis of the critique. You know, that's just one standpoint. We could have other standpoints, and from because everything's an actant and everything's a hybrid, and human beings don't actually, humanity doesn't actually exist as a separate entity. So so the critique of commodity fetishism is simply arbitrary, and so his notion of actants is basically kind of the taking commodity fetishism and applying it to the entire universe. So things become the important reality. Morton actually argues that commodity fetishism is really approached in the wrong way. The commodity fetishism is that the important thing is it's the things themselves, not the human beings. That we engage in commodity fetishisms when we fail to recognize the powers of things. And you have to understand that, Spinoza, in his criticism of free will, said that a stone that's falling, if it could think, it would believe that it was falling, and its motion was a product of its own will, and I mean, that was Spinoza's argued that, and Schopenhauer said, well, the stone would be right. and now, like, Bennett takes up that same argument. The stone is right. Stone and the inanimate objects. We're not talking about species here. That they have, they think they have will. They experience joy, so Morton actually attacks Marx in Capital, where he's describing the machine process and talking about constant capital, and Marx is talking about the coal that's firing up the machine, and the oil and the grease, and he says that Marx, just in his description, just makes these sort of go away like they're waste products. I mean, Marx is simply talking about the machine process. And so Morton says that Marx is anti-ecological because he doesn't recognize that the coal and the oil and the grease are non-human persons that exist on the same flat plane, the same flat ontology that human beings exist on. Well, this is definitely irrationalism. There's no way you can create an ecological movement or effective action or change the world or save humanity and species if you're going to fill your head with stuff like that. It's not that the rest of the world is important. We're part of an ecological system, but to forget about the fact that humanity has a particular role is disastrous.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that there's real political detrimental consequences from the adoption of irrationalist epistemologies when thinking through ecological problems. And one of them is the decentering of human interests, we could say. But it sounds like it's more than that. It's more going on there. But it's interesting, though, because the readership, these are widely read thinkers on ecology. Very few people are pointing out what you're pointing out. So how might we, I don't know, spread this more?
Yeah. Sorry.
Does that make sense? You see, like, how do we? It just feels very new what you're saying. Like, I don't really hear. I don't hear other people making this critique.
Well, yeah, that's maybe why it's important to bring it out at this point. But these thinkers, like Timothy Morton's book Humankind, which is basically I wouldn't say a critique of Marx. It's a distortion and an attempted negation of Marx. He changes Marx's notion of social metabolism into human economic metabolism, and he says it's unecological because it's an economic metabolism. But those are Morton's words, not Marx. He has no idea what he's talking about. The truth is that if you look at the work of, say, Morton or Bennett, there is no real ecology. There's no understanding whatsoever of natural science, ecosystems, climate change, the Anthropocene. I mean, occasionally a word will appear, the Anthropocene, in Morton's work, but there's no understanding of this, or environmental movements, or the history of these struggles, or any great ecological thinkers, or Marx's ecology. None of it's there. What are they doing? They're just saying, they're just taking a kind of supra-ethical stance, where they're saying, oh, ecology means saying that everything outside of human beings, that all other things are non-human persons, and that we should extend our ethics. Or they're saying, in terms of Latour's hybrids and actants and Broglio's, they're saying it's all meshed together, so you can't really have a concept of nature, you can't have a concept of humanity. Even by way of abstraction, you can't have a concept even of ecology. And so Latour fell into that trap. He argued against all of these things, and then suddenly realized, actually, the climate change problem is real and significant. And so he started trying to write some books on that, but he'd already thrown out the concepts of nature and humanity and ecology. So he had to bring in Gaia in a kind of mystical form, and the earthbound and other things, to try and get himself out of the trap. But he didn't have any way of dealing with the ecological problem, because he'd actually thrown out all bases of reason and praxis. And so what does he do? He turns to Carl Schmitt's, the Nazi theorists, really.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Schmitt is used a lot now, but he was the main defender of the Führer principle. He was out and out reactionary Nazi theorist. And so Latour, like a lot of others, turns to Schmitt's notion of the state of exception, which isn't really original with Schmitt, but uses it to kind of say it's all a question of power, and to introduce power into the dynamics, but with no conception of whose power, for whom, for what purpose, or anything. No reason, no real coherence, no connection to movements. And then, he joined the Up With the Breakthrough Institute, which is the main liberal eco-modernist group in the United States, and wrote this piece for them, Love Your Monsters, meaning love your Frankenstein monsters. We have to love our technology because we are hybrids with our technology. But all of this ends up being irrationalist. It doesn't allow us to focus on the problems and the solutions, the reason, the movements, and it's playing games at a time where humanity can't afford to play games.
I want you are known, if I might, as a very important thinker in Marxist in the field of Marxist ecology, and one of the concepts that you work with is metabolic rift. I was wondering if you might. I don't want to spend our whole conversation just critiquing. I'd also like to say something maybe more proactive and positive. Could you give us a sense of this concept for you, and perhaps maybe say a few things about what a different approach to ecology might look like? I know that it's a vast topic, but I know you're so familiar with it. Perhaps you could just give us a sense of it.
Well, the metabolic rift is Marx's is his ecological crisis theory. He came up with the notion of the irreparable rift in the interdependence social metabolism between humanity and nature that was generated by capitalism, and he was influenced by Justice von Liebig's the chemical work, his chemistry on agriculture, and Liebig had focused a lot on how soil nutrients were being removed from the soil, like the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and sent in the fiber in the food and the fiber to the new industrial centers where the population became concentrated and the nutrients didn't come back to the soil. And Marx used this to develop a whole analysis, ecological critique of capitalism, which was present in his a lot of his later works, and not fully developed, but the basic framework was there, and the notion was that we were creating a rift in inner production. We were creating a rift in capitalism between humanity and nature, and carrying out ecological destruction. If you look at it, Marx had this notion, which he introduced, of the universal metabolism of nature. Metabolism is really was a core concept of basically the original basis of all ecological systems theory, and Marx was introduced to it early on by his friend Roland Daniels, and Marx incorporated the notion of social metabolism, and he developed the notion of the universal metabolism of nature. All of nature is a universal metabolism. This is how the whole Earth system analysis in science is conceived now. But he introduced that, and he introduced the notion of social metabolism, which is really human production, but viewed from the ecological standpoint, so that our relation to the Earth, to the environment, which we're dependent on, the natural environment external to human beings, is one of is a metabolic relationship we take from nature and process, and that's the basis of life and society, and waste come out the end, and it all's tied up with reproduction. But social metabolism, the human relation to the earth, is mainly a product of production. So production is not just an economic phenomenon, which Marx critiqued from an economic standpoint, but it's also an ecological one. And capitalism creates economic contradictions, but it creates ecological ones on the other side of the coin. So they basically depleted the soil in Europe, and then they had to go to guano to get Peru. They had to go to Peru to get guano to bring back to Europe to fertilize the soil. But then this becomes the model for a theory of ecological crisis, which actually influenced other thinkers and influenced ecosystem theory and so on. And this is critically important in understanding how we enter into the struggle to defend the earth. And in Marx, you have only in Marx, really, or only in the tradition that Marx established, do you have a conception of ecological crisis that's completely integrated in a dialectical fashion with a critique of the capitalist economy. There is no other theory that does that has any way of doing that. It's entirely based on Marx. And so, but then to have post-humanists enter into the discussion and attack Marx's ecology on the basis that he didn't think a lump of coal was a non-human person, I think is, and then getting students excited about this is really a tragic thing. it's perpetuating alienation rather than combating it.
And just have a couple more questions for you. This has been so nice to chat with you. You are well, you had a relationship with the academic assistant to Lukács, who's also Hungarian Marxist, István Mészáros, and this was a thinker. Which, if you don't know about Mészáros, you can find his work on the Monthly Review website, and I'll maybe link to it in the show notes. He has an unpublished book that you're going to release in the future. Is that right?
He has his last work was Beyond Leviathan, was supposed to be a 3-volume work
on the state, on the concept of the state.
Yeah, it's Beyond Leviathan. The subtitle is The Critique of the State. And the first volume was unfinished, but about 2/3 of it was done. And I was able to put most of the rest of it together through his notes. And
what language did he write in?
He wrote in English.
He wrote in English. Okay.
And so
can you tell us who this thinker is? Because you wrote a foreword to a book that he wrote, and I was reading it, and you said he's the most important Marxist philosopher of our time. Can you say a little bit more about this person, because we don't hear about him too much?
All right. Well, first I'll explain about the book. So we published the first volume under the title Beyond Leviathan in 2022. I mean, last year. And then there was the 2 other volumes. He always had 3 drafts, and so I have the second draft, but it's all written out in hand and on tiny little pads, and it's not written in the order that it's supposed to, in terms of the organization. So I have to put that all together. I'm going to what were supposed to be the second 2 volumes, I'm going to publish under Critique of Leviathan, the title, and I'll publish them together in 1 volume, what we have. So that still has to come out, but it probably won't be able to get it together for a couple of years still. It's a lot of work. And in terms of Mészáros, he was a major Hungarian thinker, and Lukács really saw him as his intellectual heir, and they remained close for the remainder of Lukács's life. And Mészáros won the Deutscher Prize in 1970 for his book Marx's Theory of Alienation, which is by far the greatest work ever written on Marx's Theory of Alienation. There's nothing that remotely compares to it, at least in terms of explaining Marx's own thought and its implications. And that I was introduced to that very early, and it sort of swept me away. I'd studied Marx a lot, but Marx's Theory of Alienation was incredibly important. And I think the thing that was most important to me in the beginning was the notion that human beings were the self-mediating beings of nature. But there are a lot of other aspects. The structure of Marx's Theory of Alienation, as Mészáros explained it, creates a framework for understanding all of Marx's thought. Then his what is usually considered Mészáros's magnum opus is his giant work, Beyond Capital, which was all about the structure structural crisis of capital. But maybe because the book is so big, like 1,000 pages in small print, it's it's never really been fully incorporated. It's a challenge, and yet it's absolutely brilliant. His approach to social metabolic reproduction in that work was was the basis for the theory of the Venezuelan Revolution. So Chavez based his socialism for the 21st century on Mazaros's strategies. Mazaros's Beyond Capital also has a critique of Soviets type societies. So he understands that even when capitalism went away, those societies removed themselves from capitalism, but they didn't remove themselves from capital. So essentially their revolutions were not revolutionary enough. And
He's talking about abolition of the value form in a sense.
Right? Yeah. And so beyond, he wrote major philosophical works too, and on the social dimensions of historical time, dealing with all of bourgeois philosophy. But his then Beyond Leviathan was really his attempt to carry all of this to a critique of the state. But he actually argues that there was, he accepts the position of Bobbio and others that there really was no Marxist theory of the state, in the sense of the withering away of the state was never really developed. What went for the Marxist theory of the state was just arguments about the capitalist state, that with Poulantzas and Miliband and so on, but the actual Marxist theory of the state was not developed. And so Mazaros went all the way back to Plato and moved forward, analyzing all of the major state theories and developing a Marxist theory of the state that would explain what the withering away the state would really mean in practical sense, and how to carry this out strategically based on this theoretical analysis. I could talk about him
incredible,
day, but
and he was an admirer of Lukács' Destruction of Reason. Is that right?
Oh yeah, as I said earlier, he said that it was one of Lukács' 3 works where time would tell, and it's interesting. My argument is that the destruction of reason, the method of the destruction of reason, is directly applicable to present day. Remember that the thinkers that Lukács were criticizing, that he was in terms of the critique of irrationalism, say Schopenhauer, Hartmann, Nietzsche, Bergson, and Heidegger, others, Sorel. But all of these thinkers are now considered the building blocks of what we call, left philosophy, the bulk of left philosophy now, which is extraordinary situation, and it makes the destruction of reason increasingly important. And of course, we're seeing fascism and irrationalism in our time in a way that we're looking at possibility of nuclear war, destruction of the environment, and economic breakdown, intensification of imperialism, and meanwhile, we have people on the left attacking human reason.
Yeah, and part of the thing we didn't mention, and I think we'll close here, is Adorno is partially responsible for the academic community discarding this work, because he wrote a scathing but very, very short review. It's only maybe 20 pages. It's not really a review of the book. It's a series of cheap shots, and blatant lies in some cases, where he tries to say that Lukács called Freud an irrationalist, which he never did. Things like that. And you mentioned that Adorno published this in a journal which was actually funded by the CIA. Do you think that he was aware of that connection at the time that he wrote the article, or what is going on with that?
Well, this part of it's known on the left, but not talked about as much as it should be. But of course, Adorno and Horkheimer were invited back into Germany by the U.S. occupation forces, and the United States occupation forces funded the renewal of the Frankfurt School, and the Der Monat, the journal that Adorno wrote this article in was founded by the U.S. Army, and I don't know if he knew it was funded by the CIA, but and it was, along with a group of other publications. The piece was published in Encounter magazine in English, which was also published by the CIA. But there was a whole group of left scholars, whole large liberal left scholars, and even figures like Adorno, who got involved in these CIA publications and part of an intellectual movement at the time against communism, and they were all kind of hobnobbing with each other, and at least a whole lot of them, like 20 of them, said they admitted that they knew these journals were published, were funded by the CIA. Others didn't say that, or kept their mouths shut, but it was too clear, it was too obvious in the political direction of these publications and what they were aiming at, and the role and the connections was very very clear. And Adorno, he wasn't reviewing The Destruction of Reason. He was reviewing the book on contemporary realism that
Right.
written, but he commented on The Destruction of
Right.
Reason in
That's right.
review. But if you Mesereau's,
but that's what everybody cites when
Yeah.
they say, especially after Dialectic of Enlightenment, because they adopt that kind of Nietzschean skepticism onto reason in Dialectic of Enlightenment. And so by the time that comes out, and then you have this reference. So when Frederick Jameson critiques The Destruction of Reason, and maybe I could get your take on this as well, you pointed something out that I wasn't aware of, which is that Jameson said that the whole proposal of Lukács and the whole idea of irrationalism, well, it hit at a time in the American left, right when we were embarking on the Korean War.
It was, the United States, the book is finished in 52 and published in 53. This is during, and written during the Korean War, and 52, the United States set off the first hydrogen bomb. The French were involved in the war in Indochina at this time, and Lukács knew what imperialism meant in that context. Jameson says that he says only even the hardest apologist or most hardened apologist would not defend the epilogue to The Destruction of Reason. I mean, this wasn't a critique like everything else. He was just he was making a political point, but it wasn't what we call a critique. It didn't go that far, but he said even the most hardened apologist would not defend it. But what did Lukács say in the epilogue? Well, he said that who did he criticize? he criticized Heidegger, which was really the biggest problem in terms of the Western left, and he pointed out that even Heidegger's later writings were very much in the irrationalist mode, and that he hadn't repudiated his Nazism and so on, and he explained the anti-humanist context of it, and the now, you know, all these decades later, we've got all of Heidegger's Nazi writings, and he insisted that things be put back in to reflect those views, and he never repudiated it. In fact, we know that it's all embedded in his system now. Nobody can deny it. But at the time that Lukács was writing that, the Western left wasn't willing to believe that. Look at who else did he criticize? James Burnham, who was basically was a major figure in promoting the U.S. military as an economist, apologizing for monopoly capitalism under the terms of managerial revolution, and one of the most virulent anti-communists in the United States at the time. Lukács criticized Karl Jaspers, who attacked both Marx and Freud. Lukács also, you know, these were figures that he criticized in the epilogue. He criticized Carl Schmitt. He said Carl Schmitt was a Nazi and is trying to make himself good with imperialism, and he'll support any form of imperialism, German imperialism, American imperialism. And so looking back at it now, I think, well, what's so bad about all of that, that even the most hardened apologist for Lukács, as Jameson said, would not defend it? I think it's entirely defensible. He criticized the United States. He said the United States is not really a democracy, that he said it was a system that forced out any alternative political parties, where the Supreme Court delimited the laws in such a way that is entirely capitalist. He said the money controls the electoral system, and that the whole system was backed up by the lynching of African Americans. I think, and he wrote that in 1952 or 53, and looking at it now, it's exactly right. There's nothing to apologize for there. This is the reality of the U.S. system that he was depicting, that others weren't willing to consider. He argued that the United States was engaged in imperialism. So the left didn't like that. The Western left, they were trying to reintegrate themselves into this kind of order and be critics, but as Lukács said, critics, and what is his famous statement about the hotel? Anyway, the critics,
the hotel abyss, the
hotel on the edge of the abyss, in a state of affluence, like Schopenhauer. And he said this was not true radicalism or Marxism. This was not connected to praxis or reason. And but if you read let's say, Adorno is sort of a deified now, but Horkheimer and Adorno kept on going further and further to the right, especially at Horkheimer. And this is known, but we don't talk about it. Their books are read outside of historical context or meaning or anything of that sort. But if you want to get a sense of it, on the monthly review site, we have the Baron-Marcuse correspondence, where Paul Baron and Herbert Marcuse are saying together, because they were both at the Frankfurt School, what they think of Adorno and Horkheimer. And if you want to see negative views of Horkheimer and Adorno from within the Frankfurt School, look at what Baron and Marcuse were writing to each other.
Wow. Well, that's the thing I also say. In Destruction of Reason, Lukács takes on American philosophy as well, Dewey and James, and is very critical of Jamesian pragmatism as well as Dewey. So there's a whole thing there, of course, because Dewey and James were integral on the Marxist left. There's a great dissertation by Brian Lloyd called Left Out, which analyzes the way that Second International American Marxists fused their conception of Marxism to Dewey and James. And Lloyd basically says it was a disaster. Intellectually, philosophically, it was a disaster. I don't know if you've read that book, but
No, but I know the career of Sidney Hook.
there you go. Yeah, and even Burnham, who was a philosophy professor and
Yeah.
former Trotskyist.
Yeah.
Well, anyways, I don't want to take too much more of your time. We went over time, hour and 45 minutes. It's been a tour de force and a real pleasure to meet you and to have this conversation. I think people will benefit from it. A lot of great recommendations that you've given. So thanks for coming on the show, and we'll be in touch. We're also going to publish a version of this conversation in a new historical materialism journal dedicated to Destruction of Reason, which is also very exciting. So,
all right, I enjoyed it very much, and I really enjoyed meeting you in this way, and yeah. I think we maybe got off to a slow start, but we really got our engines going at the end.
We sure did. Well, hang on, and I'll say goodbye to you, but I'll end record right now.
Right.